In this training, we're going to take a look at how to build an automation action inside of SmartSuite. So if that's of interest, stick around and let's get into it. Here I am back in our automation example. This presupposes that I've created an automation and that I've already built a trigger. Please note that you'll definitely want to start with your trigger first, because if you don't already have a trigger, certain action steps may or may not be available to you depending on what trigger you want to initiate your automation. In our example, as a quick reminder, we have a scenario where in our trigger, inside of our Test2 app, a status is set to ready for review. And that's going to initiate our automation. And what we want to do inside of our automation is send an email to our manager letting them know that this is now ready for their eyes. So let's get that worked out. That is going to come out in the action element of the automation. The steps that we actually perform with the automation all live inside of the actions. Note that every automation must have at least one action, but it can have more than one depending on the scenario. So here I'll click on Add an Action, and I have the ability to send an email as needed. So I can send an email. Note that it's going to come from SmartSuite here, and I can either bring in the actual manager's email, or I can also access information that occurred previously in my automation. Previously in my automation, I had a trigger that found a record inside of SmartSuite that matched conditions. So everything about that record that we know can be used inside of the future steps of my automation as needed. So in this case, if I had the email address of my manager inside of SmartSuite, maybe it lives in my assigned to field, well then I could bring that in here. Or I can hard code that information. So in my case, let's suppose that this was the email address of my manager, I can just drop it in here. So there's an important distinction here. We're looking at the difference between static and dynamic data. Static data is data that is always the same every time the automation iterates. So every time this automation runs, right here, it would always send an email to this hard-coded email address. But that doesn't have to be the case. Maybe, in some cases, I want to bring in some dynamic data. So in maybe the body of this email, I say, this needs your review. And I want to actually bring in information for my manager to see. Well, here I now see all of the pieces that occurred previously inside of my automation. Again, in our case, that came from the trigger. Maybe they need to review the due date of the project, or maybe they need to review the priority or the status or the title of something. Whatever we want to highlight for them, we can include in future steps of this automation by pulling in the relevant dynamic data that occurred previously in the automation. Once we've filled out all of the required fields for this particular action step, so I'll say this is a test, and I scroll down to verify that everything is all set. Now we can add that automation and be sure to switch it on before moving on. Now, just as general rule of thumb, you'll want to test your automation. So once it's been created, you can then leave that particular automation and then select a test record to match the conditions that you established for your automation. That way you can send out and test if the automation actually works as planned. In my case, I'm getting an email right now sent to my email because I've moved this status to ready for review. If you have any questions about what we covered in this training, please ask them below in the comments section of this video. And until then, we'll see you in the next training.